For months, the boy hadn't spoken a single word. But tonight, from behind that closed door, his father heard a whisper. For nearly 4 months, Wesley Lancaster had not spoken a single word. Not to doctors, not to nurses, not even to his father. At night, the halls of the Lancaster home glowed with soft lamps and expensive silence. From the outside, it looked like a place of power and comfort. But inside, there was a boy who no longer trusted the world with his voice, and a man who no longer trusted anything he could not see or measure. Gideon Lancaster, a man who built his life on logic and control, told himself his son's silence was just a phase. The doctors called it emotional withdrawal. The staff whispered about trauma. Gideon called it weakness, something time and money would eventually correct. He did not believe in prayer. He did not believe in unseen comfort. He believed only in what could be proven. What he did not understand was that while the house rested in its nightly stillness, something quiet had already begun to move inside his son's heart. Down the hallway, behind a half-closed bedroom door, a soft lamp burned, and in the gentle hush of the night, a whisper rose where silence had lived for months. Gideon froze in the hallway, because the voice he heard sounded like his son. And in that moment, without knowing it yet, the man who laughed at faith stood on the edge of something that would quietly undo everything he believed. What had broken the silence? And who was inside that room with his son? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive back into the story. The Lancaster home sat in the historic district like a polished secret. Not a blade of grass dared misbehave on the trimmed lawn, and not a single fingerprint marked the antique door handles. Inside, hardwood floors stretched like quiet rivers, and chandeliers sparkled overhead. But despite the beauty, there was no warmth, no music, no laughter, no life. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was eerie. Staff moved through the halls like shadows, efficient but invisible. Their shoes never clicked against the floor. Their voices, if used at all, were whispers behind closed doors. No one lingered. No one smiled. Wesley sat alone in his room, the untouched plate of food beside him growing cold. The boy's shoulders were small, his frame even smaller beneath the soft fabric of his sweater. His eyes stared out the tall window, watching something no one else could see. A world, maybe, where things once made sense. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He simply didn't speak. After his mother left, the words stopped coming. At first, there were questions. Then there were therapists. Then there was quiet. Former caregivers had come and gone. None stormed out. None left notes or voiced complaints. They simply faded away, like mist burned off by the morning sun. Whatever they'd seen or felt was enough to make them leave without explanation. And Wesley? He watched each one go with the same expression. Blank. Hollow. Untouched. But that afternoon, someone new arrived. She stepped out of a modest car, smoothing her skirt with slightly trembling hands. Miss Thea didn't look like she belonged here, not with her weather-worn shoes or the humble twinkle in her eyes. The gates had nearly refused to open for her, as if sensing how out of place she was. The staff looked her over quietly. One offered a quick tour, half-hearted and formal. The rooms were introduced like museum pieces. No one mentioned the boy. It wasn't until Miss Thea stood outside Wesley's door that she truly felt the weight of the house press in. She knocked once. No answer. She opened it slowly, peering into a room filled with toys untouched and books unopened. Wesley didn't turn. He barely blinked. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Miss Thea didn't speak either, not right away. Instead, she stepped inside, sat down on the floor near the window, and just waited. Behind them, the house continued its hollow performance. The walls didn't echo. The air was still. Some homes are quiet because they are peaceful, Miss Thea finally whispered. This one was quiet because something was missing. No reaction. But she hadn't expected one. She simply breathed in the stillness and waited for the child to notice she wasn't afraid of his silence. Some children don't act out. They simply grow quiet with their pain. If you've ever watched a child suffer silently, staying with this story is a way of witnessing them. Something is deeply wrong with this child, and no doctor can name it. And yet, in all the stillness and silence, Miss Thea didn't leave. Why has no one been able to reach Wesley? 2 years earlier, the Lancaster home sounded different, but not in the way one might expect. There were sounds, yes. The ticking of clocks, the humming of vents, the crying of a baby. But none of it was music. None of it meant anyone was listening. Marianne had been present. In every family photo on the mantel, she stood tall beside her husband, holding Wesley with a soft smile trained for the camera. But even then, something in her eyes looked distant, as if she'd already begun to drift. After Wesley's birth, something shifted, something invisible but irreversible. Marianne walked the halls like a guest in her own life, wrapped in silence no one dared question. Her beauty remained, but the light behind it had dimmed. She spoke less, laughed never, and when she looked at her son, it wasn't disdain or dislike. It was detachment. She tried, some days more than others, but trying in silence feels like screaming underwater. Wesley cried often in those early months, wails that echoed down the long hallways. Some nights he cried for hours, his tiny fists clenched in the air, his face red from effort. Sometimes comfort came late, sometimes not at all. Rocking him felt mechanical, feeding him a duty more than a bond. And always, there was a delay. Gideon, meanwhile, folded himself into his work. Boardrooms replaced bedrooms, conference calls silenced cries. He told himself he was building a legacy for his son, for their future. But legacy means little when your child doesn't recognize your voice. He didn't see Marianne slipping. Or if he did, he didn't stop her. She'd sit in the nursery chair long after Wesley had fallen asleep, unmoving, not watching him. Just sitting. Some nights, she whispered things no one heard. Other nights, she stared at the walls like they might offer a way out. Once, she left the baby monitor off entirely. She never hit, never yelled. But Wesley felt the vacancy long before he had words to name it. Some abandonments happen while people are still in the room. The world assumes abandonment begins when someone walks away. But for Wesley, it began much earlier when her touch lost tenderness, when her eyes looked through him, when his cries became background noise to a woman drowning in her own quiet sorrow. The house still held her voice back then, but only in trace amounts. A sigh here, a murmured response there. No lullabies, no laughter, no welcome, and no one noticed. Not really. The staff kept quiet. Gideon stayed gone. The baby learned early how to be alone in a room full of people. He stopped reaching for arms that didn't open. He stopped expecting warmth from hands that moved without emotion. Even his cries shortened over time, as if he'd figured out that no answer was coming. Some children don't get left all at once. They get left in layers until all that remains is silence. If you've ever sensed a goodbye before it was spoken, this story is yours too. Wesley's wound began before anyone noticed. She didn't leave that year. Not yet. But every step she took down the long, echoing hallway pulled her further into herself. What finally pushed his mother to leave? The morning she left, the sky was overcast, soft and gray, like a whisper hanging over Charleston International Airport. There were no slamming doors, no angry words, no final arguments. Marianne didn't rush, and she didn't cry. She moved with quiet resignation, the kind that doesn't ask for understanding, only space. She stood in the doorway of Wesley's room, her coat draped neatly over one arm, suitcase in the other. The boy was still asleep, curled on his side with one small hand tucked under his chin. His breathing was steady, unaware. Marianne stepped closer, kneeling slowly at his bedside. Her hand hovered over his cheek for a long moment, almost afraid to touch what she was about to leave behind. Gently, she bent forward and kissed his forehead softly, reverently. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words landed on ears too young to understand. Or maybe they were never meant for him at all. Downstairs, Gideon stood in silence. He held a coffee cup he hadn't touched, wearing a suit too expensive for a morning like this. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't even walk her to the car. To him, the damage was already done. And in his mind, damage could always be fixed with the right school, the right therapist, the right check. The front door closed behind her without a sound. That was how Wesley lost his mother, not to death, not to chaos, but to quiet choice, the kind that breaks more slowly and cuts more deeply. He woke hours later to the sound of nothing. Her scent lingered faintly in the hallway. Her coat no longer hung on the hook. Her perfume had faded from the air. At first, he walked the house like he was still dreaming, checking each room, looking behind doors, not crying, just searching, confused, then quiet. He never asked where she went. Not once. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He simply sat on the rug in his room and stared at the wall. His food remained untouched. His voice unused, and by the time Gideon realized what was happening, Wesley had already vanished in plain sight. The doctors called it trauma response. The therapists used words like selective mutism. But labels did little to touch what had truly broken. Wesley's silence is not stubbornness, it is grief. A kind of grief that builds in the bones. One that takes root before you know its name. And when love leaves quietly, it takes a part of the heart with it. He didn't forget the kiss on his forehead, or the way the house felt different that morning. He just didn't know how to say it, or who would hear him if he did. Not every child shouts their pain. Some close the door to their voice and live behind silence. If you've ever witnessed that ache in someone too small to name it, this story is your witness too. Gideon doubled the staff. He hired specialists. He built a nursery wing that Wesley never entered. But the boy who once cried loudly now said nothing at all. And no one, not even Gideon, could figure out how to bring him back. Why hasn't Wesley spoken since that day? The first night Miss Thea entered Wesley's room. She didn't expect welcome. She didn't expect words. She expected only quiet, and she was right. Wesley lay curled on his side, his back to the door. His breathing was even, but his eyes were open. She noticed that without needing to see them directly, some silences hum with awareness, and this one wrapped the room like a heavy curtain. She didn't speak at first, just moved gently, slowly. She set down a basket of folded clothes and began tidying. One book was returned to the shelf, a toy train placed back on its track. A sock tucked beneath the bed frame was quietly rescued and returned to the drawer. As she dusted the windowsill, she began to hum a soft hymn, nearly forgotten by time. It floated through the room like memory, not loud, not for him, just present. She didn't try to make him sing along. She didn't ask him to listen. She simply allowed her presence to exist beside his pain without disturbing it. Night after night, she came, always with folded clothes, always with a story under her breath, always humming something that reminded her of the little church back home where healing was slow, and God felt closer in silence than in speech. She carried her faith the way some carry water, gently, carefully, daily. She never touched him, not even his blankets. But every night, once the lights dimmed and her quiet cleaning was done, she knelt just inside the doorway and prayed, not long prayers, not loud ones, just whispers of hope into the stillness. Keep him tonight, Lord. Let his heart rest, even if his voice stays quiet. Wesley never moved, never blinked, but he knew she was there. Something in the weight of the air told him this woman did not come to fix, only to stay. Gideon noticed. He called her into the study one afternoon, his voice as clipped as ever, his expression tight with controlled indifference. "Don't get emotionally involved," he said flatly, tapping his pen against the desk. "You're here to maintain structure, nothing more." Miss Thea didn't flinch. She didn't nod either. She only answered, softly, "Children need more than medicine, sir." He didn't reply. The conversation ended. But from then on, he watched her more closely. She still came to Wesley's room each night, still hummed, still prayed, still folded what little there was to fold. Every act was simple, but it was compassion in motion. She didn't expect miracles, but she left the door open for one. She is risking her job with quiet compassion. Some hearts heal not because they are forced to, but because someone waited long enough. If you've ever waited on love to return, you already understand her. Wesley, still silent, began to notice the sounds she brought, the creak of her shoes, the rhythm of her folding, the hymns that danced just beneath her breath. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. But one night, as she closed the door behind her, he blinked, and that was new. Will Wesley ever respond to her presence? He woke up with a gasp. The nightmare was already slipping away, like fog melting in morning light. But the feeling remained cold, trembling, sharp. Wesley sat upright in bed, heart pounding against his ribs like it wanted out. The room was dark, but not unfamiliar. Shadows clung to the corners like they always did. He didn't cry. He never cried anymore. But his hands shook beneath the blanket. The door creaked open a few inches. Soft footsteps crossed the room. He didn't have to look to know it was her. Miss Thea. She didn't rush. She didn't flip on the light or start asking questions. She simply came to the edge of the bed and sat, just far enough not to frighten him, just close enough to be felt. He stared ahead, body rigid. Then something different happened. She reached out slowly, gently, and touched his hand. It wasn't a strong grip, not something to hold him still or bring him back. It was light, steady, warm. Her palm, weathered but calm, cradled his smaller hand with reverence. And then, for the first time, she spoke into the silence, not with a hymn or a story, but a whisper meant only for his soul. "Peace, Lord," she breathed. "Let this child rest. Let what frightens him fade." The words were so soft they nearly dissolved into the air. But Wesley heard them. Every syllable landed like a drop of water on dry ground. He didn't answer. He didn't nod, but he stopped shaking. His breath, still shallow, began to slow. His eyes blinked once, twice. He listened, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something that had gone quiet long ago. Faith does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes like a breath. She didn't speak again. She stayed by the bed for several minutes, still holding his hand, still radiating calm like a lantern lit low in the dark. Then she stood and left the room without looking back. Wesley didn't sleep right away. He didn't even close his eyes. But the air had changed. Something invisible had shifted quietly, internally. It wasn't big. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Something shifts in Wesley quietly, internally. If you've ever watched a child tremble through something they couldn't name, then you know the courage it takes just to listen. Some healing starts there in the dark, with someone who stays. He stared at the ceiling. The blanket was still wrapped around him, his hand still warm where hers had been. He didn't know what the words meant, not all of them, but they felt different than the ones he remembered from before, the loud voices, the big promises, the closing doors. These words didn't demand anything. They simply stayed. Downstairs, the house was silent. Gideon was asleep in a room filled with unread books and untold thoughts. Will Gideon ever know what happened that night? The morning sun filtered through the Lancaster hallway in thin beams, stretching across the hardwood like golden ribbons. Gideon moved with purpose, briefcase in hand, phone to his ear, voice clipped and professional. Another meeting. Another deal, another morning wrapped in numbers and control, until he heard it. Not a sound, at first. Just a voice soft, steady, familiar. Not the boy's, the woman's. Miss Thea. Her voice was low, reverent, coming from behind Wesley's partially closed door. Gideon slowed his steps and paused just before the threshold. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words stopped him. "Lord," she whispered, "remind him that he is not forgotten, even when the house is quiet, even when his heart feels small." There was no performance in her tone, no theatrics, just calm belief. as if she were speaking to someone as real as he was. Gideon frowned. He pushed the door open slightly more. "You're filling the boy's head with false hope," he said, voice low but sharp. "Don't do that." Miss Thea turned, slowly. She didn't look startled. She didn't apologize. "Hope isn't false just because you don't believe in it," she replied gently. He scoffed. "Prayer won't fix what's broken. It's emotional nonsense. He needs professionals, not fairy tales." Miss Thea didn't argue. She simply turned back toward the bed where Wesley lay still, eyes open, watching. She bowed her head once more, whispering softly again words Gideon couldn't quite catch. And then, barely audible, came another sound, a whisper, small, fragile. But there, Gideon froze. He turned his head sharply toward the boy. "What did you just say?" Wesley's lips had moved. Just barely. His voice had cracked like something unused for far too long. But he had spoken. After months of silence, of specialists, of endless reports and sterile rooms, his son had spoken. Only once. Only then. Only in response to faith. Wesley speaks, but only in response to faith. Gideon stood frozen in the doorway, something in his chest unraveling. He looked at Miss Thea, who remained kneeling beside the bed, eyes closed, hand near but not touching the boy. The man who mocked belief had just watched it open the mouth of his silent child. The words he mocked were the ones that reached his son. If you've ever dismissed something you didn't understand, only to see it reach someone you love, this moment is for you. Sometimes, the smallest prayers carry the greatest weight. Gideon didn't speak again. He didn't know how to. Wesley's eyes drifted shut again. Calm. Unafraid, Miss Thea rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. She said nothing to Gideon, didn't gloat, didn't explain. She simply walked past him in silence, her footsteps soft, like her faith. He stood there a while longer, staring at the boy, at the thin light streaking across the room, at the space where something invisible had just taken place. What did Wesley just say? The halls of Charleston Medical Center smelled like disinfectant and distant worry. Children laughed from the playroom nearby. Nurses moved in, practiced rhythms, and monitors blinked in gentle pulses. But inside room 214, the air held something different. Stillness. But not the kind that signals despair. It was the stillness before something new. Wesley sat upright in the hospital bed, hands curled around a small paper cup of water. He hadn't spoken again, not yet, but his eyes were no longer hollow. They moved now. Slowly, curiously, tracking sounds, watching faces. He had begun to eat. Just a few bites at first, a piece of toast, a spoonful of oatmeal. Nothing rushed, nothing dramatic, but it was happening. Dr. Nolan, a man known more for data than wonder, stood at the foot of the bed with a clipboard in hand. He flipped through notes as if somewhere buried between numbers an answer might appear. "There's measurable improvement," he said at last. "But I can't quite explain it. No change in medication. No new therapy." He glanced toward Gideon, who stood in the corner, arms crossed, not in anger this time, but in quiet disbelief. There was no smugness in his posture, no arguments left to throw. He had seen the boy's silence break. He had heard his son whisper, and now he was watching him return, piece by piece, in a way no prescription had managed. Miss Thea sat nearby, knitting something small and unfinished. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but when left alone, her lips moved in silent prayer, steady, quiet, private. She never pressed, never claimed, but every day she showed up. And the more she came, the more Wesley seemed to lean not physically, but inwardly toward whatever warmth followed her in. The child who once turned his face from food now finished half his lunch. The boy who once stared at the wall now blinked when someone entered the room. The smallest things became the biggest signs. This wasn't science. This wasn't chance. This was grace moving slowly. Gideon left the room at one point, standing just outside the glass wall. He rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them. But it wasn't the cold that unsettled him. It was something older, a question he couldn't form, an answer he couldn't control. He watched Wesley through the glass, watched Miss Thea pray silently beside his bed, watched the quiet unfolding of a healing that made no sense. And for once, he didn't laugh. The healing is real but fragile. Not every miracle comes loud and fast. Some arrive in whispers, in slow returns, in half-eaten meals and eyes that finally look back. If you've ever prayed without knowing who heard you, this is your story, too. Later that afternoon, Dr. Nolan returned to update the charts. The numbers looked better, but nothing in his notes could measure why. "Continue what you're doing," he muttered to Miss Thea, not quite meeting her eyes. She just nodded and whispered again near Wesley's shoulder words only heaven could hear. The boy shifted under his blanket. One more bite, one more blink. But healing, like glass, can be easily shattered. Will the healing last or disappear? The hospital room was quiet, not from sorrow but from peace. The machine still blinked, the clock still ticked, but something in the air had softened. The boy who once lay curled inward now sat upright, eyes steady on the man seated across from him. And then it happened. Wesley moved his hands slowly, deliberately, and reached across the white blanket. Gideon didn't breathe. The small fingers touched his, then wrapped around them. No words, no sound, just contact. A connection he thought he might never feel again. The boy who had shrunk into silence had reached for him. Gideon blinked hard, covering their joined hands with his own. He said nothing, just stayed there, anchored, present. Wesley didn't speak. Not fully. But some walls don't fall with noise, they crumble in touch, in trust, in quiet bravery. From that night on, Gideon stayed late, sometimes falling asleep in the chair, sometimes reading aloud, though Wesley still didn't respond with words. But he listened. He blinked at the right moments. He smiled once. It was enough. Across town, under the low-hanging branches of a churchyard oak, a woman stood with her hands folded in front of her. She wore no expression, only a stillness that said she'd been watching longer than anyone knew. Marianne didn't come close. She didn't speak. She simply stood near the edge of something she once called home. A ghost, not of death, but of regret. She watched from a distance, heart pressed between memory and mercy. Inside the hospital, Miss Thea folded the last of her belongings. Her contract was ending, as quietly as she had arrived. She didn't make announcements. She didn't say goodbye with fanfare. But Wesley knew. The day before she was set to leave, he stepped toward her in the hallway. No music played. No words were spoken. He reached up, arms small but sure, and hugged her. She closed her eyes, arms wrapping around him, slowly, carefully, as if holding something sacred. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for letting me stay long enough." She said nothing else, and Wesley didn't need her to. Healing comes, but reunion does not. Gideon drove him home 2 days later. The city passed by the windows, the familiar, the foreign, the things broken and rebuilt. Wesley sat in the back seat, hands in his lap, watching the world go by with new eyes. As they pulled into the driveway, the house stood just as immaculate as before, but something was different now. Inside, Gideon didn't go to his office. He followed Wesley upstairs, sat beside him on the bed, and stayed. Every night after that, he stayed. Down the street, beneath a shaded tree, a woman stood once again watching the house where she used to sing lullabies she no longer remembered. She didn't step forward. Not yet. She wasn't ready, and maybe neither was the family inside. Sometimes God heals the child and leaves the adults to keep learning. Some endings don't arrive with celebration. They arrive with quiet gratitude. If this story touched something tender in you, staying connected to stories like this is not a click. It's a shared prayer. He found his voice before his family found its way back together.